This evening I am talking on a topic which I have given a title, The Ultimate Challenge for Humanity, Unity, Peace and Love. This is very much in accordance with at least one, if not all of these three objects of the Theosophical Society. Many of you already know what these three objects are. You can also consider them as the three pillars of the Theosophical Society. And these are to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. How relevant. And do not let the word brotherhood mislead you. It is the family of humanity. It is not regarding male or female. The second is to encourage the comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science. To be a theosophist does not require that you adhere to one religion or another religion. We are not so concerned with that. We are concerned with the ultimate realization of truth. There is no religion higher than truth, and therefore we are seekers of truth. And the third object, which is in accordance with that seeking, to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. Now, to be a theosophist is basically to have an agreement with those three objects and to act in accordance with those three objects. And so, personally, I am, as most of you who have heard me speak on previous occasions know, that I am a Buddhist of the Theravada tradition. I was a Buddhist monk for 23 years, which is quite a long time, and I'm very grateful for that experience. The wonderful exposure that I had to meditation masters and people who set an example of what a spiritual life could be. I am always grateful for that experience. And as I said, I am now grateful to be part of the Theosophical Society as a layperson, no longer a Buddhist monk, but still a Buddhist. And I feel very much at home within the Theosophical Society because it is a big umbrella. All seekers, seeking in good faith, who are in accordance with these three objects, are welcome to be part of this family, part of this community. And so this topic this evening, the ultimate challenge for humanity, unity, peace, and love. I think that this year, when I first thought of giving this lecture, it was many months ago, but it wasn't that long ago. And I think the incentive was just from having lived through this traumatic year. Not only the pandemic, but also the terrible polarization that exists in our society and the seemingly endless conflict that is all around us, at least expressed verbally. And this certainly is unsettling, unpleasant, and for me something that I find baffling, that so many good people, and I really do believe that the vast majority of people are good people. My neighbors are good people. The people that I work with are good people. When I walk down the street, the majority of people I encounter, I'm sure, are good people. I know there are many people in this world who are not necessarily good in the sense of having altruistic intentions. I know there are many people who have very selfish, mean, cruel intentions and are quite happy to act on them. But personally, I don't interact with many people like that. Most of the people that I interact with, most of the people in my community, my immediate community, and I assume this may be the case with you as well, because we are amongst the fortunate people, the blessed people, those of us who can live in a stable society which seems to be reasonably harmonious at some level, where we feel safe. Nevertheless, there is always that underlying tension of conflict that seems to be so prevalent especially in our media, and especially around topics such as politics and religion and many other aspects. So when I thought of why is it so difficult for human beings to live together in harmony? Why is it so difficult for us to create peace? Why is it so difficult for us to experience and share love for one another? And then I was reminded of this object of the Theosophical Societies to create a new nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity, which seems to indicate that this is an object that we would like to accomplish, actually to bring people together with no distinction of sex or race or creed or belief, caste or color, and be a brotherhood, a united, harmonious group. And yet it seems to have been an object that we have not as yet realized. From its inception, the Theosophical Society started in 1875, if I am correct, with these three objects. It was not long after its foundation that various schisms or disagreements and the splitting off occurred. And this seems to be a pattern that we find in all endeavors that human beings undertake. It is almost something that is destined to undermine our higher ideals. And I can appreciate that in the worldly pursuits, we can say in the pursuits for power and money, things of the world, which are usually associated with competition and conquering and overpowering and acquiring, becoming more powerful in terms of acquisition. I can see that preoccupation would be fraught with conflict and possibly strife and war. But what really is puzzling to me is when I see this exact same thing happening over and over in all forms of so-called spiritual endeavors, amongst people who are spiritual seekers, amongst people who are committed to certain ideals. And so if we look back at the various religions, all of them, when we look back at the history of religion, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, these are the main religions, but there are scores of others. We will inevitably see that there is this initial high ideal and then the inevitable fragmentation that takes place in these groups of seekers and aspirants. And it is quite disheartening. In actual fact, if we look at the many world religions and their histories, we could become quite disenchanted with the value of religion at all, because it has brought so much conflict, so many wars, so much fighting, so much cruelty, so much killing in the name of religion, in the name of the so-called high ideals. And that is a sad, sad story. I find that very disheartening. And I do see it as a challenge for us to overcome. As I said, I'm a Buddhist, and so I know more about Buddhism than the other religions, obviously. And I'm intrigued by the Buddhist teachings because I really do believe that the Buddhist teachings, which are the teachings of the Buddha who lived in northern India about 2,500 years ago, and he left behind a body of teachings which I find to be extraordinarily inspiring, as well as just what he himself taught and lived. And it is a living tradition because it continues to the present day, and we have many Buddhist masters whom I have met, I have been fortunate to meet, and I find many of them very, very inspiring as embodiments of some of these very ideal teachings. Yet when I read the Buddhist scriptures sometimes, it is also perplexing. You know, the Buddha is enlightened and he's teaching, he's a monk, a Buddhist, he was an ascetic and a renunciant, lived an ascetic life. He became enlightened and then he started teaching. And this teaching is very beautiful. I mean, when you read it, it's so beautiful. It's the Eightfold Path, and I may speak a little more about the Eightfold Path, but what it points to and the standard of understanding and aspiration and the life that it is encouraging, the qualities that it is encouraging are so inspiring. And so I would just imagine being in the presence of the Buddha, imagine hearing these teachings, having him there. You would think that the community around him would automatically be just the most united, peaceful, and loving group of human beings. And possibly for the most part, they were. Nevertheless, it is interesting to read some of the accounts that are in the Buddhist text, the canonical text, that represent, I do think, quite accurately what took place and recount some of the events that occurred during the Buddha's life. One of them is very interesting. It occurred at Kosambi, which is a place in the Ganges Valley, or was a place. And there occurred these are disciples of the Buddha, they're Buddhist monks, and it was supposedly quite a large community of monks living in monasteries in that region. And just by chance, there arose a disagreement between two monks. And these were quite senior monks because they had disciples and followers. And, you know, in my mind, they're senior monks. You think they're well versed in the teachings, they're well practiced, and maybe accomplished in that teaching. And yet, when you read the story, it seems so ridiculous. There was a slight disagreement between these two monks regarding a very small matter of discipline, or whether a particular event was wrong against the discipline or whether it was right. A trivial thing, etiquette, something to do with etiquette. I won't go into the details, but it was trivial. But it led to some misunderstanding, and that misunderstanding grew into some disagreement, and then an all-out conflict, where one accused the other of misrepresentation, the other retaliated by calling the other one a liar, and they had their followers, and they encouraged their followers, of course, to support them, each one, in accordance with their interpretation of this situation. And this blew out of proportion, apparently, as it's recorded in the scriptures, whereby this two groups of monks could not live together any longer. And the story is that there arose this schism of, as it says, striking against each other with words of dislike, criticism, abuse. It wasn't a physical conflict, but certainly a lot of, say, backbiting and I would probably say a lot of angry words being thrown around. Fortunately, in those days, they didn't have the internet, and so it was just limited to who was in that particular area that could be involved in this conflict, verbal conflict. So this sounds strange to me. These monks, I mean, if they're Buddhist monks, they're supposed to be peaceful and enlightened, and why are they behaving like this? And but that's not the end of it. The Buddha went to this community and spoke to them and taught them, said, this is not the way for us to live together in harmony and in peace. Put aside these conflicts. Put aside these harsh words. It is not beneficial. It does not conduce to peace. It is not the way to live. He went to one group. He went to the other group. He tried to resolve their disagreement. What do you think they said? Lord, you are enlightened. Abide in peace. Leave this matter to us. We will settle this. And the Buddha had no way of convincing them to put aside their disagreement. Now, the Buddha is very wise. You would think he is also, their teacher, that they would listen to him. No. So the Buddha said, these fools, they do not know what they say. They talk without thought, angry words, empty words. They do not know the harm they are doing. And he left. He left and went on retreat. It was not until later that these foolish monks came to some realization that they were really being very stupid and went to the Buddha and asked for reconciliation, and once again were able to reestablish a friendliness of harmony, loving kindness, and actually spiritual community. Now that seems to be, you can say, well, that's a story in the scriptures that took place 2,500 years ago. Well, actually, there's I can give you a lot more stories, much worse than that. I was thinking about this evening. One of the events that occurred at the monastery where I ordained, I became a Buddhist monk in Bangkok in 1972 at Wat Phleng Vipassana, which was it's still there, a meditation monastery in Bangkok. And I remember being newly ordained as a novice and just becoming familiar with the other monks, getting to know what these monks are like. And contrary to my expectation of these holy monks, I began to see that they were quite flawed human beings. And in particular, there were two monks that I want to talk about this evening. One I call the angry monk, because he was just a very kind of intense person, and he was built like a bouncer. He had muscles. He was short, but stocky and big. And he was always really intense, a kind of this presence that made me feel that he was angry. And there was another monk there whom I called the talking monk. He was rather thin and tall, and he talked all the time. Now, I couldn't understand Thai at the time, but he could speak English, so I could understand him. And he just talked about anything, any nonsense. He would just go on and on and on and talk. And these two monks did not get along very well. And the best thing for them would be to be apart. Unfortunately, they lived in the same monastery, close together. And one day, it blew up. The angry monk couldn't hold it in anymore. The talking monk didn't stop talking. The angry monks just picked up this thin talking monk and beat him up. And I mean literally beat him up. And the police were called. And this poor monk was black eyes, and it really got out of control. And you think, wow, is that possible? Wow, why is that possible? These are Buddhist monks living in a monastery. Aren't they supposed to be peaceful and living together in unity and harmony? Yes. But they're flawed. And this is why for human beings to create unity, peace and love, to live in unity, peace and love, is a tremendous challenge, because we are working with flawed human beings. We are working with human beings who are still driven by ignorance, motivated by greed and aversion, with ego and pride. And when you're trying to create peace, unity, and love, and you're starting with this, a flawed human being, I think it is bound to be a very difficult undertaking that is probably doomed to failure. Actually, human beings have a great difficulty even imagining what a state of unity, peace, and love could be. Just think of heaven. Human beings, how do we think of heaven? We think of God, all powerful and all that, and yet Lucifer is not happy. He rebels. There's war, conflict. This is in the Christian and Judaic tradition. In the Hindu tradition and Buddhist tradition, they always talk about the war between the Devas and the Asuras, the gods and the jealous gods, and they're always at war with each other. So this is what human beings think of. How can they possibly conceive of unity, peace, and love as an actual state that can be realized? I don't think we can. And I don't think we can realize it for humanity. And that is why I do feel that the Buddha emphasized something a little different. It is strange that a fully enlightened being such as the Buddha, if anybody can enlighten everybody else, it should be a Buddha. If anybody can bring peace to the world, it should be a Buddha. If anybody can create just even a nucleus of a brotherhood, universal brotherhood of humanity, the Sangha, the Bhikkhu and Bhikkhuni Sangha, it should be the Buddha. And yet, even the Buddha was not able to do those things. He certainly did not abandon the effort of trying to create the conditions that are conducive to the evolution of that community. But he did not make that the focal point of his teaching. What he did was to address the root problem, the flawed human being. The root problem is in the heart and mind of the human being. So the Buddha's teaching, rather than primarily focusing out there, trying to make the world and society perfect, he did put a lot of effort in trying to give guidance, in trying to encourage the evolution of that which is conducive to harmony and well-being. But the focus of his teaching, he knew where the root problem that had to be solved was, and that was pointing straight in to the individual heart and mind. The root problem is in the mind that is not yet peaceful, pure, and full of love. There's a very interesting story in the scriptures again about the Buddha's life. On one occasion, the Buddha, he quite often, he traveled everywhere on foot, and he traveled all over the Ganges Valley, teaching various people who were interested. But often he would spend time alone in the forest and jungles, as was the custom of the Buddhist ascetic monks and other ascetics of the time. On this occasion, the Buddha spent the night in this forest, and it must have been in the months of December or January, something like that, because it was the cold season in the northern India, in the Ganges Valley. And he spent the night there, and in the early morning, Buddhist monks don't, have very little. He had his robes and his alms bowl, and he slept on the ground. And in the morning, he was sitting meditation, cross-legged, and it must have been close to a trail, because villagers and merchants would travel from village to village on these trails, and it must have been where the Buddha was sitting, must have been close to one of these trails, because in the early morning a merchant came by and saw the Buddha sitting there, and he went to pay homage, because it was the custom. A spiritual seeker, a religious mendicant, we pay homage to him. And the merchant said to the Buddha, "Venerable Sir, did you spend a pleasant night here?" And the Buddha replied, "Well, if anybody can say that they spent a pleasant night, I am one such person. I am a person who spent a pleasant night here." And the merchant said, "But Venerable Sir, how can you have spent a comfortable, pleasant night? You're laying on the ground. It's kind of, there are only a few leaves on the ground. It's hard. These are the cold months of the year. Your robes are thin and patched, and it would hardly seem that it would be a very pleasant night." And the Buddha replied, "Well, merchant, imagine there is a person of wealth, such as yourself, who lives in a castle, who lives and sleeps in a bedroom on grand bed with pillows and blankets, and is guarded on and is looked after in every way. If that wealthy merchant with all of that physical comfort is laying on his bed at night, and his mind is afflicted by fear, do you think he would sleep well? No, Venerable Sir. Well, what about if his mind was afflicted by anger and resentment? Do you think he would sleep well? No, Venerable Sir. Well, what about if his mind was afflicted by remorse and guilt? No, he wouldn't be able to sleep. What about if his mind was afflicted by desire and lust and wanting? Would he sleep well? No, Venerable Sir. Then, merchant, know this. Greed, hatred, and delusion have been cut off at the root, have been abandoned. Therefore, I sleep, or I spend a pleasant night here on the ground. And this is a very telling story, because throughout the Buddha's teachings, he pointed to this as the goal of the spiritual life. Turning the attention inwards, the root of all problems, the root of all conflict, the root of all wars, the root of all the problems that humanity experiences and individuals experience are greed, hatred, and delusion. Blinded by ignorance, led by craving, we put out the causes for conflict, the causes for war. We act and live in ways that generate those states. And as long as the mind is flawed in this way, I do not think there is any chance for human beings to create peace, unity, and love. The cause of war starts in the mind. The cause of conflict is in the mind of human beings. It is even in I think it is in the Charter of the United Nations, where it says that the cause of war arises from the minds of people. Therefore, the peace should also come from the mind of people. Only really peaceful people can hope to bring peace to the world. Only really loving people can bring love to the world. And so the Buddha's emphasis on cultivating the heart and cultivating the mind as a primary responsibility of every spiritual seeker who wants to be a blessing to the world. In helping myself, I help others. In helping others, I help myself. This is contrary to the position of many people who see it as either one way or the other. So these Buddhist teachings are very much directed at finding and understanding and purifying oneself. Finding means turning the attention inwards to actually start to know oneself, to actually start to see what one is thinking and feeling, and then how one is acting and speaking and relating, and what one is creating as we interact with the world around us. The first step is beginning to see oneself, beginning to become aware. And so those of us who have been fortunate, you see, there are many of us now, I think, who have been blessed with having heard teachings, having been inspired. We actually do have a large number of human beings. I don't know if it's the majority or not the majority. I don't really know. But there is a large number of human beings who actually appreciate these ideals of unity, peace, and love. I mean, that is a wonderful, just to appreciate that as an ideal, to aspire to. It hasn't always been the case. And amongst a great many people, it's still not the case. I know that in this world there are many, many people who have not the slightest interest in unity, peace, and love. They don't think that that's the purpose of their lives. And please do not romanticize nature. Do not romanticize the jungle. Do not romanticize the more primitive or the much earlier, simpler communities, societies, tribes, people. It is easy for us to romanticize of how they lived in such great harmony and peace, and everything was so hunky-dory and rosy. I do not think so. There has always been the competitive, and because of the desire for self-gratification, self-preservation, self-propagation, there's always been the instinct that drives not only human beings, but all life in a way which is competitive and against, eat or be eaten. And this is so in the jungle. Life in the jungle is no fun. Animals in the jungle eat or be eaten, and it is a struggle. Let us not romanticize that too much. I do feel that as human beings we have gradually evolved, come out of the jungle in many ways, and many of us have been educated by some of these spiritual teachers that we have encountered. I find myself blessed just to have, one, come across Buddhism, the ideals of Buddhism. Before I came across Buddhism, I had never even imagined, it was never even a thought that a human being could actually be free of greed, hatred, and delusion. I just assumed that greed and hatred were part and parcel of the human being. That's what I am. It's my nature. That's the Buddhists, yes, that nature, that is part of nature. Greed, hatred, and ignorance. Selfishness is part of nature. Cruelty is part of nature. To kill, to murder, to rape, to do everything nasty is part of nature. Nature allows that. But it is not the best of nature. And so these spiritual teachers point us to something that is better. A possibility of something that is better. That it is possible for us to come out of the jungle, to grow out of just living by instinct, to grow out of the self-obsessed, just self-gratification, preservation, propagation, into a more enlightened human being whose world and life is so much more. And that is what somebody like the Buddha personified. And the teachers whom I met, my teacher, Venerable Ajahn Chah, to me personified that. Someone who could be so at peace and so loving and so at ease with life. Not cold like a stone. The Buddha was not cold and dead like a stone, although some people will say that a stone is not dead, fine. But interact with the world in a way which is really coming from loving kindness, compassion, joy, and a sense of tremendous peace. And these, we say, are the attributes of the enlightened being. We call them the Brahma Viharas, or the divine abodes, the divine emotions, if you want, altruistic emotions, loving kindness towards all beings, compassion, and this natural reflex to try and relieve the suffering of others, experiencing joy at the joy and happiness of others, and the peace that is natural to the mind that is awake and enlightened. So the Buddha focused his teaching to encourage each individual to do the work, to address the root cause of the problem. And this, he said, is a path of training that needs to be cultivated. And it's called the Eightfold Path. The very first of the Eightfold Path is called right view, right understanding. And it is very, very enlightening to be exposed to such a teaching, because depending on what we understand, what values we have, depending on our views and attitudes, will determine our intentions and our aspirations, which then in turn will condition our speech and action and how we go about life. So the right view that the Buddha greatly encouraged, the first thing is to recognize that greed, hatred, and delusion are actually a problem. That acting on greed and hatred is not the path to happiness, is not the path to fulfillment, neither for oneself nor for others. That we can, the view that we can somehow achieve happiness and fulfillment by taking advantage of others, by exploiting, by hurting, by cheating, by lying, by creating disruption. If the way we live is contributing to conflict, strife, and war, we cannot achieve peace or happiness. And this is a rather radical view, actually, because most of us think in this polarized way. It's either my happiness or their happiness. For me to be happy, they can't be happy. And that is how much of our society is based, much of our attitude and the way our societies are structured. It's set up to be competitive, us against them. And this is another beautiful aspect of the theosophical teachings, that the oneness of life, which I think is another way of expressing the Buddhist feeling of, in helping myself, I help others. In helping others, I help myself. It's this seeing the wholeness, that it is not really possible to achieve happiness at the expense of others. And also to begin to have an appreciation of what real happiness is, that acquiring and having pleasure or wealth or power in itself is not necessarily, or certainly not happiness. And many of us have seen that over and over again. Happiness must come from within. There is nothing out there. It doesn't matter where we go, what we do, what we achieve, what we gain, it will not make us happy. As long as there is the root cause of unhappiness, greed, hatred, there's craving, wanting more, will never be satiated. So this is the Buddhist teaching now, is to, if you really understand this, if you really have an appreciation of this, for my happiness, for me to realize happiness, I must be able to overcome this basic flaw, this sense of craving for things, the craving for achievement, the sense of setting up duality of me against them. That the true happiness comes from a mind that is freed from greed, freed from hatred, freed from ignorance. If we really have that appreciation, we will have a different approach to life. Our values change. Our intentions change. Our aspirations change. So the Buddha said, from right view arises right intention, and he tried to give us a good roadmap. He said, these are right intentions. If you want to really attain this goal of ultimate happiness or true happiness, true peace, these are the intentions that you should set firmly in your mind. These are the aspirations that we should be aiming for in our lives. Renunciation, the intention of renunciation, because that is the exact opposite of the intention of greed and craving for me and mine. That obsession with me and mine, self-gratification, self-preservation, learning to share, learning to give, learning to put aside, learning to say enough, learning to say, well, I've actually got a lot here, thank you, and appreciate it. Learning to share with others. So this ability to open the heart and share with others in every way. And in Buddhist countries, this is one of the most beautiful qualities that is so evident. How generous Buddhist people are. They may not be virtuous in many other ways, but they are very generous, just because this teaching is so ingrained. So the intention to actually be a person with an open heart, willing to share with others, not just for me, but for others as well. My happiness, their happiness, my happiness. The second right intention is the intention of goodwill, loving kindness, rather than anger, irritation, hatred, goodwill, friendliness, loving kindness, that this is something we can generate within us, the attitude of goodwill and loving kindness towards all beings. At least start off with somebody close by, your own family maybe. And I'll talk a bit more about that towards the end. And the third intention is the intention to live a harmless life, to do no harm, or as little harm as possible, to tread very lightly on this planet. Being alive and having a body and having to eat, it's just naturally, it implies that we are a burden on the planet. We consume. But the intention is to create as the least harm as possible and to try and relieve suffering wherever possible. So if we really start to see that it is really our aim to achieve happiness and to eradicate these root causes that create conflict, greed, hatred, and illusion, we must establish these new intentions. Intention of renunciation, intention of loving kindness, and intention of harmlessness, not hurting in any way. And once we establish those intentions, we must carry through with them in the way we act and speak. And speech is one of the very, very important ones. And this is where often people fail, like those Buddhist monks in the time of the Buddha. I'm sure they knew they had right view, supposedly, and right intention, but then they didn't act on it. They started to speak in ways that were very disruptive. And so right speech is very important if to really put some effort into cultivating speech that is conducive to peace, to harmony, to unity, speech that reflects our intentions of goodwill and loving kindness. And the Buddha did, he was quite explicit. Right speech is not only being truthful, yes, honesty, truthfulness is imperative. It is critical. It is fundamental. Once you do not know that the person is actually speaking the truth, there is no way that you would ever be able to have trust in that person, and there is never the possibility of harmony and living in harmony and peace. Without trust, there is no peace. Without truthfulness, there is no trust. Being committed to speaking the truth is a very fundamental cause for the arising of unity and harmony in a group. Without it, there is no hope for it. So I cannot stress the importance of speaking honestly, truthfully, at the right time, at the right place, in the right way, out of loving kindness, in a way that is beneficial. So much of the distrust, so much of the suspicion, so much of the polarization and conflict arises from the lack of trust, because of the lack of commitment to truth. So the speaking the truth, refraining from telling lies, is fundamental from the Buddha's perspective. Avoiding backbiting and malicious slander, trying to break up the unity by pitting one group against another, spreading rumors about people, that is the cause of conflict, strife, and misery. It should be our intention to speak not only the truth, but speak in a way which helps to resolve conflict and disagreements, finds ways of bringing people together, trying to reinforce the sense of unity, belonging to the one family, the one group, humanity, rather than relishing the gossiping, backbiting that creates schisms, fights, mistrust. Refraining from harsh and abusive speech that hurts. So much of the, even comedy, so much of language these days is around that. Refraining from idle chatter that just clutters the wavelengths, just clutters everybody's minds. Today, media, television, internet, radio, papers, everything, and it's just so much chatter, and that's why there is so much confusion. Right speech is so fundamental to creating harmony that I personally, feel that we should all be very, very committed to training ourselves. The Buddha went on, and tonight I will be running out of time, but the Buddha went on and spoke about right action, how to refrain from acting in ways that disrupt and cause conflict and cause suffering and cause, let's say, misery. Killing, stealing, adultery, lying, and taking drugs and variety of things that make us more stupid than we already are. Now, these are guidelines as to the Buddha encouraged in terms of how to act in the world with regards to the way we live our lives. Earning a living is important. To try and earn a living, a livelihood, by means that are not exploitive of others. To act with our bodies in ways which are not hurtful and hurting others. To speak in ways which are conducive to harmony, conducive to unity, conducive to peace. So we have the right understanding, we have the right intention, we have this right, speech and right action and right livelihood. So why doesn't it happen? Because we have to be mindful. We have to be present and awake and know what we are doing, what we are saying, how we are relating. There is a great deal of interest these days in the practice of mindfulness. And mindfulness is a word that is English, obviously. The Buddhist term for mindfulness is rather special, though. He called it, the Buddha termed it Samma Sati, right mindfulness. And this is very important point, exactly what the Buddha is talking about when he says mindfulness. He's not talking about just alertness or just being awake or just being present. He's actually relating that state of being awake and mindful to those other factors that we've spoken about. Right view. So that mindfulness is intelligent, has an understanding that is correct. Otherwise, just to be alert, you can be a very alert bank robber. You can be a very alert murderer. Actually, if you want to be a bank robber, you probably have to be very aware and very alert indeed. That is not right mindfulness from the Buddhist point of view. So, mindfulness here is educated mindfulness, mind fully present with the understanding of right view, right understanding. And with the intention, it's educated, it has a purpose. The intention is renunciation. The intention is loving kindness. The intention is to harmlessness. And to act on that. So my mindfulness is to make sure that I speak truthfully, to make sure that I speak in a way which is conducive to harmony, to make sure that I speak kindly and gently, to make sure that I speak at the right time and with things that are of some consequence and not just babble on non-stop. To this mindfulness that is educated and associated with the intention to help me act accordingly so that I don't go around killing and stealing and committing adultery, keeps me away from those ways of behavior. This mindfulness that looks after and enables me to follow the path. So this mindfulness has to be educated, intelligent, with right view, and then it has to have some oomph. It has to have some strength so that it can actually encourage me to implement. And that comes from the effort, the right effort. So that this mindfulness is educated, it's got some strength, and it helps me cultivate the path that leads to peace that leads to the ultimate happiness, which is enlightenment, which is the human potential of every human being. And only such a human being who has realized this enlightenment and eradicated those root problems of greed, hatred, and delusion may have a chance of bringing peace to the world, at least more peace rather than more harm. Unfortunately, many people who have very high ideals and very high even I would say high aspirations, they want to fight for peace. Fight for peace. They want to bring peace to the world. And because the root problem is still there in the mind and in the heart, quite often people of that inclination end up being another source of problem in the world. You know, when very interesting what Gandhi said for people who want to undertake non-violent resistance to oppression, to injustice, discrimination, the things that we see are wrong. For someone who wants to really undertake non-violent response, it requires that this person be very, very disciplined. And I would go further and say that it requires this person to be rid of those poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion, or at least have them well under control. Because otherwise, it'll end up being that this person becomes worse than the oppressor, just as has happened many, many times over. There's a very interesting story from the scriptures. I mean, it's difficult to relate to these days because we don't have ox-drawn carts, but there is this merchant and he's got this very big load of goods on this cart that is being drawn or pulled by this very scrawny ox in India. And the merchant is impatient and he's whipping the ox to make it move faster and pull this wagon along to get to the market quickly. And there's this very religious man on the side of the road seeing this. How cruel, how terrible, this merchant beating that poor ox. How dare you do that? That's terrible, cruel, and you're a monster. And he gets so enraged and righteous indignation, he can't help himself. He jumps onto the wagon, grabs the whip and starts whipping the merchant. And we have seen this over and over again. So, my friends, if we want to have any chance of creating peace, harmony, and unity, let us start by working on ourselves. I'd like to give you a task to do. Spend some time with yourself. Begin by being peaceful within yourself. Start off by being peaceful with your body. Turn your attention to the body. See if you can be really, really peaceful within that body and direct some loving kindness to it. Can you be peaceful with your body and love your body, even when it does things that you don't like? Can you be at peace within yourself and feel a sense of contentment and deep joy within yourself for even a few minutes. Start there. Feel that peace, that joy, that loving kindness within yourself, and then try to generate it towards, start with something really easy, your kitten. And kittens are very easy to love, except when they keep you up at night, and then you've got to work at it. See if you can generate that feeling towards your family, your husband, your wife. And then see if you can act on it in the way we speak and the way we relate. We want to save the world? Well, let's start in a small step. Unity, peace, and love. If we develop those within ourselves, we will be able to bring it out into the world. Peaceful people bring peace to the world.